Flávia, set the scene for us. What's happening right now with housing in Northern Ireland?
So a lot of people would say that right now in Northern Ireland we have a housing crisis, and that is for a number of factors. Most recently, the latest statistics that are published by the Department for Communities, which essentially tracks the number of people that are currently waiting for a social home, are showing that those numbers continue to grow. They're showing that in the last decade or so, the people that have full FDA status, which basically means that they are considered as homeless, has more than doubled in the last decade, and the waiting list itself, so the overall number of people that are waiting for a home, has increased again by 25% in that period as well.
And your report in the Belfast Telegraph, it mentions that just 41 new social homes have been started this year. How does that actually compare to what they need?
So to clarify, this year we're talking about financial year. So for the housing executive, that runs from April to March. So since April this year, they have only started 41 new properties. They say that they also have 404 completions recorded already and about 5,000 other properties currently under construction. But to put that into perspective, so in the programme for government, there is a target that 5,850 social homes will be started by 2027. That's obviously only 2 years ago. When this was introduced, there was an estimate that in order to meet that target, you would need to be starting around 2,000 new starts every year. So 41 really is just a fraction of the amount that's needed.
And as you've mentioned there, we've seen homelessness, it's more than doubled in the past decade. We have people sitting on the streets, there's single parents there living in box rooms, some with 2 children. What's driving that rise?
So there's a number of factors that will be driving the sort of continued increase we've seen in people waiting for social homes and being accepted as homeless. If you look at the actual statistics, they do break down the most common reasons that people will present as homeless to the housing executive. One of those, the main one, tends to be that accommodation is not suitable, and that will be for a variety of reasons. So disability, houses needing adjustments and people not being able to find the houses, relationship breakdowns, family disputes, loss of rented accommodations, a big one. Rents in Northern Ireland are currently rising faster than anywhere else in the UK. Things like domestic abuse as well will feature into that. So those are the reasons why people are sort of presenting as homeless in the first place or in need of a social home. But the fact of the matter, I suppose, is that we are just not building enough homes to meet that demand. So 41 new social starts since April this year, that's obviously not going to make a massive dent in a list that has 49,000 applicants. And to be clear, that's 49,000 applications. The real number of people is likely to be a lot more because there will be families in that list as well. So I suppose the crux of the issue would be that we're just not building enough, and that's why that figure of only 41 social starts since April this year is quite shocking.
And 49,000, that's a staggering figure. Anybody listening to that would be shocked that 49,000 people are on the social housing waiting list in Northern Ireland. Obviously, there's an awful lot of debate around immigration, asylum seekers here in Northern Ireland at the minute. How does that feed into all of this?
So I think when we're talking about the impact that immigration's having on issues like housing, it's really important, I think, to be really precise about the language we're using. So asylum seekers won't actually factor into this list. So when someone arrives in the UK, or in Northern Ireland in this case, as an asylum seeker in the first instance while they're in the system, which means that they have not been granted the refugee status and the permission to stay in the UK, their housing is dealt with centrally by the UK government. So it's all dealt with by the Home Office. Now, that's not to say that there's no impact on housing, on wider housing market in Northern Ireland. Of course, houses still need to be found to place them, and obviously that has an impact on supply. But the numbers are very, very, very small. So 2,000 asylum seekers, again, that is asylum seekers, that's not people that have been granted refugee status that are looking for houses from the housing executive. So if we're looking specifically at our social housing waiting lists and the supply side from the housing executive, then asylum seekers don't really factor into those figures. The numbers do tend to be quite small.
Yeah, suppose, as you say, there's 2,000 people on the asylum seekers list that even were looking 2,000 homes, one home each. You take that away from the 49,000, there's still 47,000 people that would be on a waiting list. Not 47,000 homes, albeit, but still those amount of people needing to be housed. Now, what are the biggest barriers to building more social housing? Is it funding? Is it planning? Is it infrastructure? Or is it just the lack of political will for it all?
I think if we're being honest, it's probably a combination of all those factors. Funding has been a massive roadblock when it comes to new social builds. Gordon Lyons, our communities minister himself, admitted in June that funding constraints basically meant that they were looking at a maximum of around 1,150, I think it is, new social builds this year. Again, far short of the actual target of 2,000 on average a year needed. So funding does play a big role in it. There are also other issues like wastewater infrastructure, which we keep hearing a lot about, it creates a bit of an issue when you're trying to build new homes if there is no wastewater connections available. Political will, again, some people might say that is part of the issue, that we're just simply not allocating enough resources to build new social homes, but also that a lot of funding is being diverted from homelessness prevention. So we're not stopping people getting to the point where they need to present as homeless in the first place. And again, there'll be loads of reasons why people will say that's the case, but funding does seem to be one of the biggest issues.
And Stormont has a target of nearly 6,000 social homes by 2027. Based off what you've seen, is that realistic?
So that is a target of new starts. So those aren't houses that necessarily need to be completed by that period, but certainly the expectation and the target that's been set is almost 6,000 new social starts by 2027. At the minute, it's not looking likely that that is going to happen because those targets just haven't been necessarily met. And the issue I suppose you have with these kind of targets is that for every year that you miss the target, it kind of creates a backlog. So that goal just moves further and further away. So if this year we continue on this trend, then we don't meet the 2,000 new starts this year. That means that next year your target's no longer 2,000, it's potentially 3,000 because you've not started enough this year. So yeah, I would say that based on the figures, it's not looking overly promising.
And a lot of numbers there, anybody listening, statistics, numbers, everything. But the actual fact of this is, Flávia, that there are people behind these numbers, there are real families behind all of this. What does this crisis mean for people who are waiting for a home right now?
It's a lot of uncertainty for people. It's hard to imagine, but it must be absolutely heartbreaking to find yourself in a situation where you have no stability in terms of where you're going to spend the night. And that's particularly heartbreaking if you've got children with you. You can't give them that security. And we do see a lot of these stories as well, you know, people ending up having to be placed in temporary accommodation like hotels, Airbnbs, whatever that may be. And I think sometimes people think, oh, staying in a hotel sounds really glamorous and, you know, you have all these perks. That's not the reality at all, especially if you're a family. You're having to live in a hotel. There's maybe you're far away from your friends, from your relatives, children are far away from school. And oftentimes those placements are temporary as well. So you're not staying in those places for long enough to really set down any roots. And you're constantly having to be moved around. So it is a huge amount of uncertainty. It's a huge amount of pressure for people to be living in this situation. And yeah, I think you're right. We can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, 49,000 people, potentially a lot more, because again, we're looking at children. So, you know, we're talking men, women, children that face uncertainty because they don't have one of the basic needs, which is a roof over their head every night.
One of the topics that you obviously cover an awful lot of, it's something that actually comes up in my timeline on Facebook, on TikTok, things like that recently, is succession. So a lot of people seem to be put out of their home after this what seems to be somewhat a potentially flawed succession policy from the housing executive. Does it feed into all of this as well?
I mean, it all feeds into it. Successions, if we're looking at overall numbers in terms of people on the waiting list and people that are ending up homeless across Northern Ireland, successions are likely to form a very, very, very small percentage of that overall number. That's not to say that there aren't issues there and that there aren't problems with the overall policy, but overall they probably do account for a very, very small percentage. I suppose the issue that the housing executive finds itself in because of the huge pressure that they are under. And I do think it is fair to say that they are under a huge amount of pressure. There's this list that continues to grow. They have certain statutory obligations to house people when they present as homeless, and they have very limited resources to work with at the minute. And one of the things that we're finding is that when there is a social household and the main tenant in that social tenancy passes away, there is a process by which that tenancy can be passed on to other people living in the house, and that would be called a succession. There have been changes to the way that policy works recently, which means that a number of people have failed when they've applied to have that tenancy succeeded to them for various reasons, and that can often mean that they end up being evicted from the house. Sometimes these are houses that people have lived in for years with their family members, so they are essentially losing a family house in that case. And obviously the perception, I suppose, is that the housing executive, which is the body that's responsible for housing and for providing homes to people, is in effect in these cases making people homeless. And that is the perception, I think, that is out there. But again, as I say, it is such a hugely complex issue. And I think there's actually a common piece that's going alongside my news piece today, where Peter Carr, who wrote the piece, says that actually the issue isn't necessarily just about building more houses, it's about building the correct type of house. And I think that that's probably something that we don't talk about enough, but that is at the crux of this kind of issue, in that some people are maybe being evicted from the family home because they're single, for example. So the argument would be, you don't need to be living in a 3-bedroom house because you're one person. But the backlog in social housing is such that you're not able to then place that person in a flat, for example, which would be more suitable to their needs. So the problem that I think the housing executive finds itself in is it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that they have the statutory obligation to house people. They don't have enough houses. They've ended up using a lot of temporary accommodation where the cost just continues to skyrocket, which is another issue entirely. But it does create these other difficulty in other smaller policy areas, I suppose, like successions, and where you do hear these heartbreaking stories of people who are having to leave their family homes after years, especially after being bereaved, which I think is another element of these cases which adds a sensitivity to it and which makes it a lot more difficult for people to deal with, is that this is coming at a very difficult time for them where they've lost a loved one, and then they are having to leave this house. But it's just a symptom of really a social housing sector that is absolutely at breaking point.
And dumb this down for me if you can. I like simplification. If I'm 18 years old and I'm leaving house tomorrow for whatever reason, and I have just either myself or me and my partner, we're leaving home for whatever reason, I can't afford to buy a house in Northern Ireland. Realistically, how long will I be on that waiting list for?
It's a very difficult question to answer, because the way that the system works is that the housing executive will try and assess priority. It's not a perfect system, but that is the way that things operate at the minute. So if you were to find yourself in a position where you can no longer afford your rent, or whatever the circumstances were, either way, you find yourself in a situation where you have nowhere to live and you present to the housing executive, you will go through an application process and they will go through your circumstances. And based on the answers to each of those questions, you will be assigned points. And those points will culminate in what they would call your housing need. So at the minute, for example, so we've got those just over 49,000 households. Of those 49,000 households, there's, I think, around 34,000 that would be considered in housing stress. So those are people that would be considered at the higher end of need. And of those, there's another 32,000 that are considered to be full FDA status, which essentially means you are classified as essentially homeless. And those are the people that would be given the priority. So it's not an easy answer, and the process is really complicated, especially for someone who doesn't have a fixed address. It requires a lot of form filling. It requires a lot of communication with the housing executive, which can be really, really complicated. But unfortunately, you will be assessed based on priority, based on all the other people that are also on the list. So not the best way to put it, but essentially you are competing with all those other people for a very limited number of houses, and they will do so based on priority.
And finally, one of my straight to the point questions. Who fixes it? Why have they not? And what do they do to fix it?
Who fixes it? It's a really hard question to answer, because there are a lot of different moving parts to this. And when you look at the system as a whole, there are different things that could be done to fix, I suppose, in inverted commas, I would say, to fix the issue. Some of the key areas that people would point to is that more investment needs to be directed into homelessness prevention. So we need to stop focusing on people when they've reached crisis point, and we need to be helping them to not get there in the first place. So that's one of the things that a lot of people who work in the sector would say that definitely needs to happen more. The other thing that, if we're talking funding in terms of easy wins for the housing executive in terms of securing more funding, one of the things that, and I know that they are working on this, is reducing the reliance on temporary accommodation. That's an extremely expensive area for them at the minute, and one that they are trying to cut back on use, because if they can save money in that area, then that's money they can direct into homelessness prevention. It's money that they can direct into building new social homes. And of course, funding would be great. More funding means more social homes, and more social homes means that we can get people off the list more quickly. But as we know, just saying that you need more funding doesn't necessarily mean that it comes through, and that does require political will.
Flávia, you cover a lot of these stories for the Belfast Telegraph. Anybody that's having a housing issue, how can they get in touch with you?
You can get in touch with me by email. It's flavia.gouveia@belfasttelegraph.co.uk. You can find me on TikTok as well. Feel free to DM me. I keep an eye on all that kind of thing as well. Twitter, basically any of the socials, I'm there. So get in touch with me there, or get in touch with me by email.
Flávia, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.